It begins with warmth. A bright November morning fills the small town of Ridgefield. Flags flutter in the crisp wind, and the clear sound of a brass bugle carries through the square. The Veterans Memorial gleams in the sunlight. People stand with hands over hearts, red poppies pinned to their coats. The words, "Thank you for your service," ripple softly through the air like prayer. Across the street, a man sits on the stone steps of the old church, half hidden in the shadow of its doorway. His coat is worn thin. His breath fogs in the cold. He holds a brown envelope close to his chest as if it were something fragile. His name is Tom Mercer. He is 72 years old, and he too once wore a uniform. He watches the crowd from a distance. Their applause rolls like a wave, but none of it reaches him. The faces blur together in the reflection of a shop window, flags waving in the glass between him and them. Tom rises slowly, his knees crack, his hands tremble. He walks toward the donation box outside the church and slides the envelope inside. Inside, it is a small sum of money, the last he has, and a note written in careful, shaking handwriting. For those who still believe kindness matters. The crowd across the street cheers as the bugle fades. The sunlight warms the monument. Behind them, the wind turns colder. Some men are remembered with parades. Others fade quietly between the applause. Tom pulls his coat tighter and begins to walk. He was once the kind of soldier people wrote articles about. Afghanistan, 2004. 3 tours, 2 commendations, 1 scar that never healed right behind his left ear. They used to call him the calm one. After the war, calm didn't pay the bills. Scars didn't fill out forms. He came home to a woman named Evelyn. She had a voice like morning coffee, steady, gentle, and warm. Their house was modest but filled with light. She baked pies for the neighbors, played old jazz records on Sunday afternoons, and reminded him that goodness was a kind of discipline. Together they volunteered for a small local charity that helped veterans find housing. Tom fixed broken radios for them, saying every working frequency felt like a small victory over silence. Then Evelyn got sick, the kind of sickness that steals days so quietly you hardly notice them slipping away. The Veterans Affairs Office lost her paperwork. Twice. By the time it was corrected, the help she needed had already come too late. When she passed, Tom sold the house. He donated the money to that same charity. He said she'd want someone else to have a roof. Since then, he has lived by small routines, mornings spent sorting bottles behind Ridgefield hardware, afternoons tightening the screws on other people's radios or patching an old coat for a stranger. He survives quietly, the way old soldiers do, with habit and pride. People still call him Sir, not because they know who he is, but because something in his posture commands it. He nods, thanks them softly, and moves on. Winter comes early this year, the kind that settles into the bones. His cough lingers. The corners of his eyes water from the wind. The nights grow longer, the benches colder. He knows what the cold can do. He's felt it in deserts, in tents, in places where warmth meant survival. But this winter feels different. The streets are lonelier now. The silence cuts deeper. Tom never asks for help. He never begs. When he walks past the thrift shop, he pauses in front of the window where a small electric heater hums, glowing orange through the glass. Beside it, a paper sign reads, "Stay warm this season." He stands there a moment, feeling the faint heat through the pane, then continues down the street. At night, he sleeps on the steps near the church. Someone once left a blanket there, and he keeps it folded neatly beside him. Above, the stained glass windows glimmer faintly under the street light, angels painted in fading color. He looks up at them sometimes and whispers, "She'd like the view from here." In his pocket, next to a folded photograph of Evelyn, he keeps a single dog tag. The edges are worn smooth, the letters faded, his name, his blood type. A reminder that once someone saw him clearly enough to carve his identity into steel. He doesn't wear it around his neck anymore. He just holds it sometimes, turning it in his hand until it catches the light. The town sleeps. The last echoes of the ceremony fade, and the man on the church steps remains, a quiet figure against the stone, invisible to those who walked past him hours ago. Not everyone is seen before they disappear. Dignity isn't taken. It is returned when someone finally looks and chooses to act. He kept the dog tag and the photograph together in a small pouch, a pair that fit like 2 pages of the same ledger. The metal named him. The photo reminded him why names mattered. The failure began with a letter that never reached him. After Evelyn died and the house money went to the foundation, Tom's life narrowed to small certainties and dull shocks. Nights came with dreams that felt more like places than images. Dust, a distant shout, a light that would not stay. One winter, after a night of bad dreams, he slept through a breakfast delivery and then through the day. The next morning, he found an envelope on a bench and a stamp that read "No forwarding address." There had been a hearing scheduled for his disability review, a routine appointment that would have kept his file active. The date had been printed on a letter that was routed to an address no one used anymore after the mortgage trade. The postal system rerouted, the envelope returned. In a world kept by dates and stamps, a missed day is a hinge. He missed that hinge. He walked into the regional office 2 weeks later, thinking it would be a formality. The reception area smelled of coffee gone flat and printer toner. Fluorescent light hummed above like a low warning. A woman behind the counter slid the keyboard forward and looked at him the way people look at accidents. Sorry for what happened, not for being part of it. "We show a no-show," she said, voicing a rule that felt like a small, unbreakable thing. She clicked and scrolled and printed a notice for him to appeal. Her hands moved with the tired precision of someone who had used the same apology for years. There was no malice in her voice, only the exhaustion of a person with paperwork stacked the height of her shoulder. Her sympathy had no currency in the ledgers that governed him. The system closed his claim on that single administrative mark. As months of form letters created a blizzard of paper, Tom turned to work his hands could understand. He soldered a radio's connections until the speaker hummed. He tightened loose chair legs. The work steadied him because it was a world where parts fit and sound returned, a stark contrast to the arithmetic erosion of his benefits, where each delayed prescription and postponed test was another number subtracted from his life. But survival is not only about steady hands. The nights grew colder. Blankets left at the church smelled faintly of mildew and old perfume. The damp clung to his cuffs. He coughed into his sleeve and tasted metal. On nights when the past surged up, a truck backfire making him drop his coffee, breath burning, he would retreat. He spoke to Evelyn's photograph sparingly, a ritual reserved for anniversaries or when the wind sounded like a distant command. He'd tell her about a fixed clock or a mended toy, small updates to stitch the world together. The photograph was his purpose, the tag, his identity. He had a sharper edge than people expected. He snapped once at a volunteer who tried to fill out his forms with rehearsed sweetness. He had told a man who tried to hand him charity food to keep it. The man left, offended. Those small flaws kept him human. They kept pity from making him less than he was. The practical realities were blunt. A missed co-pay meant a missed appointment. A missing document meant a canceled test. The words from technicians landed like pebbles, each one making a ripple that cut deeper. He learned the economy of small things. A returned can for coffee, a repaired radio for a sandwich. He refused the label of victim, but the world left its impressions. The blanket from the church carried the scent of mildew. His cough left a metallic taste. These were the textures of a life lived at the margins, private and undramatized. On a late afternoon in November, after a day spent coaxing a radio to life, Tom walked past the thrift store window where the small heater glowed orange through the glass. The heat was a visible thing. For a moment he pressed his forehead to the cool pane and let the light soften his eyes. The dog tag in his pocket clicked once, a tiny, private sound. He did not know then that sound would be the only clear note that would pull someone else's memory later. The small metallic echo that would make a different pair of eyes look twice. That is the wound he carried. Not the lack of a parade. He moves before the town wakes. Tom keeps his hours small and practical. Dawn finds him at the alleys collecting bottles, the canvas bag at his shoulder thudding with glass. By mid-morning, he's at the community center with a small box of tools, screwdriver, spool of solder, a cloth that smells of oil. The work is precise and very loud inside him. It shuts off a certain noise. He can't otherwise quiet. A boy arrives one day with a plastic truck whose axle has been chewed through. The child's lip trembles. He speaks the word please with the bluntness only children have. Tom takes the truck and sets it on his knee. He pries the bonnet open with a fingertip and finds the tiny mangled axle. As he works, his hands make small, exact movements, clean the contact, file down the burr, seat a new pin. The radio in the corner hums. The community room smells of coffee and old paper. He is halfway through the repair when the world folds into a sound that is not here. A distant clang. A delivery truck backfiring down the street unmoors him. For an instant, the table is sand, and the speaker is wind, and everything smells like burning. He flinches hard enough to nick the thumb that holds the truck steady. The cut is small. He presses his thumb to the rag, breath quick, the dog tag in his pocket clicking twice like a small bell. The memory comes fast and fierce, a flash of heat, a shout he cannot place, the metallic odor of spent cartridges. He can hear a voice that isn't in the room telling him to move, and a weight on his shoulder that is not real. He breathes through it, counts the screws out loud, 1, 2, 3, until the noise settles into order. The simple ritual of repair drags him back. When the truck rumbles again, the boy laughs, and Tom's shoulders loosens in a breath that might almost be a smile. Later, at the hardware store, a woman presses folded bills into his palm, change from a bake sale, an old-fashioned charity wrapped in white paper. Tom's fingers close over the money. He feels the weight of it against his palm. Warmth, immediate help, shame. He holds it, hesitates for a beat that sounds like the space between two heartbeats. and then pushes the bills back into her hands with a soft, "I'm all right." The woman's eyes wet. She presses a hand to her mouth. Tom walks away with his jaw tight. He tells himself he refuses for pride. He tells himself it is because of Evelyn's voice about giving, not taking. He is part right, part stubborn, part broken. Outside the shelter later that afternoon, the air cuts thinner than it did in the morning. A young man who sleeps at the doorway pulls his coat up to his ears and shakes. His fingers are raw and blotched with wind bite. Tom watches him through the glass of the thrift shop where the little heater glows orange behind winter displays. The young man's teeth chatter. A child walks past, clutching a thin blanket. The image settles in Tom like a stone. That night, when he folds his tools away, the memory of the boy's truck and the boy's laugh rests against the sight of the man on the steps. He does not say a prayer. He holds the dog tag and lets its tiny click steady him. The metal sound is a small private rhythm. Identity answering purpose. His life is not drama. It is a ledger kept in small acts, a soldered joint, a returned toy, a sandwich accepted and later given away. He does not seek notice. He does not want an audience. But the sight of that man in the doorway changes the math. If he continues to refuse charity, if the system continues to close the small doors that once offered aid, then another night will pass for someone less able than he is to bear it. He sleeps later on the church step and thinks of heat as a thing that can be shared in small ways. The heater in the shop window burns like a beacon. For the first time in a long while, temptation is not only for himself, it becomes a possible means to cover two bodies through a night. The next morning he hums while he sorts bottles, but there is a new edge to the tune. The dog tag in his pocket taps once as he bends to pick up a bottle. The sound is precise, like a metronome. It keeps the time for a man who has lived too long on borrowed minutes. When he walks past the thrift shop again, the heater's orange light presses at the glass. He does not press his forehead to the pane that time. He keeps moving, and the decision inside him turns from possibility to plan. He woke to a gray that felt like weathered metal, a sky pressed low enough to make the air hard to breathe. Winter had come early, and the cold found seams in his coat he thought closed. His cough had settled into him like an old companion. In the morning it left a thin, rusty taste on his tongue. At the VA regional office, he slid his folder across the counter and watched the receptionist move with the economy of a person who had learned to apologize with her eyes. She printed a list, stamped a date, and tapped a line of requirements with a pen. "We can start the appeal," she said. "You'll need ID, discharge papers, proof of residence." Proof of residence. How do you prove you reside in a doorway? The words landed like a hinge closing. He thumbed through the folder and felt the missing page like a missing tooth. He had slept poorly the week before. Wrong room, wrong clock. A night that blurred into morning. Somewhere in that blur, a notice had slipped away. Now a stamped no-show sat where a hearing should have been. He moved through the motions in a shorter time than it takes to breathe. Photocopy, stamp, coins into a slot. The copy machine jammed and the clerk muttered about parts on back order. The appeal form earned a received stamp that felt like small consolation rather than rescue. Each step added a minute to an already narrow ledger. The line at the counter hummed with people whose papers were as knotted as his. Outside, the wind cut his face. He watched a bus pull away and thought of the thin man huddled by the shelter doorway, a shadow of breath rising and breaking in the cold. Paperwork promised a future that was measured in weeks. The cold asked for a solution tonight. He stopped at the corner where the thrift shop window held a small electric heater humming orange behind glass. Beside it, a paper bag held a loaf of day-old bread. Heat and bread, together in the window, looked obscene in their simple availability. At the hardware store, a woman offered him change from a charity sale. He accepted the coins, turned them in his palm, and for a moment the temptation to let them solve tonight flickered. He felt the weight of the money and the weight of a vow he had made years ago. He hesitated. The pause was a compass point. He pushed the coins back into the woman's hand and said, "I'm all right." Though his voice sounded thin even to him, the woman's eyes filled. He walked out with the steadiness of someone who had practiced refusal. 2 blocks later, he saw the man at the doorway again, fingers raw and trembling. The sight was a blade he could not look away from. The image of the heater's glow and the man's shivering hands folded together and made a new shape in his mind. The arithmetic that had seemed private widened. If he did nothing, someone else, closer to the edge than he, would spend a night that might be too long. He folded the folder into his coat and felt the edges bite his palm. The dog tag in his pocket clicked once against a coin, precise and small. The sound steadied him like a metronome. He thought of forms and stamps and the receptionist whose hands trembled with exhaustion. He thought of the hunger in the man's voiced breath. Paperwork had a logic that punished absence. Cold did not wait for logic. The plan that had been a rumor in the back of his head began to take shape like a map with a single route. The heater offered warmth. The bread offered sustenance. The night promised a length that would measure whether someone would wake in the morning. He had never wanted to cross a line he had not chosen, but the line between dignity and survival had become thin as glass. He walked past the window once more, letting the heater's orange glow wash his face in its reflected light. He did not press his forehead to the pane this time. He kept moving until the doorway where he sometimes slept came into view. He sat on the step and took the dog tag from his pocket, turning it in his palm until the letters caught the weak light. Tonight, he told himself, warmth would not be for show. It would be for keeping a man alive and, maybe, for keeping someone else alive, too. The thought was not triumph. It was a calculation. It was necessity turning to purpose. He rose, folded his coat about him, and began to walk toward the shop. He waited until the streetlights pooled like coins on the pavement, and the last window shoppers had drifted away. The cold had teeth in it that night, sharp enough to bite the skin at the back of his neck. He moved with a slowness that was not hesitation, but calculation. Earlier, when he walked past the shop, he had seen the delivery man hand a box to the owner. The owner had answered his phone, stepped out, and left the little back delivery door to fall almost shut. It was a human thing, a small courtesy of someone busy and distracted. The door was not locked. It was a crack, a fact, not a moral judgment. Tom eased in through the narrow service entrance. Cardboard leaned like tired buildings. The heater hummed on its display as if it were breathing. The bag of day-old bread sat nearby, wrapped and waiting. He surveyed the room quickly with the eye of a man who knows how to read weight and angle, the heater on its pallet, the bread beside a stack of seasonal displays, the back door with its loose latch. He thought of the man on the shelter steps. He thought of the boy whose truck had squealed back to life earlier that day. He also thought of his own ribs hollowing with cough and the way his hands shook when he had tightened a screw that morning. His reasons braided together: self and other, short-term survival, and a rough calculation about where he might be safest. Jail was a blunt possibility, a place with warm blankets, steady food, and something that smelled like order. The idea sat in his head like a bitter pill. He did not want to sell. He wanted to stay free. But the ledger of options had thinned. He lifted the heater, its weight solid, and tucked the bread beside it. The dog tag in his pocket clicked once, a sound that steadied him. He whispered the truth of it. "I need warmth." Then quieter, because the idea now had a second edge. He needs it more. A board creaked. A security guard stepped into the doorway, his face etched with the wear of a man on a double shift. Tom set the heater down for one slow breath, half turning as if to put it back. For a moment, they were two men holding the same small script of exhaustion. The guard said, "Sir?" and the single word filled the room. Tom did not explain. There were no speeches left in him. He gathered the package again and moved toward the back exit, carrying his answer. The guard raised his radio, the motion quick and administrative. The act of calling it in made reality bureaucratic. A radio report, a note in a log, a sequence of ordinary things that would lead to a lockup. Tom stepped into the alley, the guard's flashlight beam following him. He ran, splashing through a puddle, the dog tag striking the heater's casing like a frantic heartbeat. He slowed at an intersection, the siren still distant. He looked at the package in his arms, warm and smelling of yeast. He did not feel triumphant. He felt necessary, and the complicated relief of someone who has broken a rule to preserve a life, perhaps two. He said it aloud, steady and matter-of-fact. "I need warmth, and he needs it more." The guard's footfalls grew louder. Tom tucked the heater under his coat and moved into the dark, towards the church steps, to see who would survive another night. They met him where the alley opened to the side street. The security guard had not charged. He had simply called it in, a radio check that set the station into motion. Two officers arrived with boots that made small wet noises on the pavement. One of them took the heater from Tom with a careful lift, as if handling something breakable. The station smelled of bleach and old coffee. Fluorescent tubes hummed a steady note. Intake moved with efficient, edged calm. Name, date of birth, read the rights, sign here. Tom's coat hung on a peg. The heater and the paper bag of bread were placed on the stainless processing table under the light. An officer opened Tom's pocket to inventory his belongings. A dog tag slipped free and rolled across the metal with a small, clear click. The sound cut through the hum of the room in a way that felt like a small bell. An evidence technician, a young woman at a side desk who handled the tagging, paused mid-stamp when the tag landed near her hand. She glanced at the letters, then at Tom, and the look she gave was not curiosity so much as attention, an acknowledgement that this object meant more than the sum of its metal. Forms were completed in a succession that had the rhythm of a machine. Photos were taken of the heater and the bread, each frame numbered and saved. A clerk stamped an evidence bag and slid a label across the table. The officer spoke in low, practical tones about logs and transfer. Their voices had the neutral cadence of people who process incidents rather than judge them. One offered Tom a paper cup of water, and the gesture had the small softness of a routine kindness that stops at policy's edge. The intake nurse asked about his cough and took a temperature, pen clicking on a clipboard. She wrote notes into a tablet, checked boxes that might qualify him for a referral, and then added a line about follow-up depending on appointments. The words were both promise and procedure. They required time and a chain of small approvals. The technician bagged the heater, sealed the bread in plastic, and placed both items into a numbered evidence envelope. She photographed the dog tag next to the label, and then, when the clerk's hands were busy, tucked the tag into a small, clear pouch and clipped it to the folder with a metal clip. Her finger brushed the letters once, almost unconsciously, before she returned to the task. That brief touch was not a decision, but it was a mark of attention. Some memories begin as a brush. They took his statement. The questions were straightforward. Where had he been staying? Did he want medical attention? Were there witnesses? Tom answered plainly. His voice had the rasp of cold. He noted the church steps and a shelter when there was room. When asked if he needed immediate care, he shook his head. He did not ask for words that might complicate the form. He did not want to make things theatrically worse. The booking camera clicked. His hands were photographed, palm and back. The heater was labeled and tagged as property. The dog tag's letters glinted in the evidence photograph, small and legible. On the inventory sheet, someone printed his name and wrote the chain numbers. The facility accepted the material facts and turned them into records. Objects became entries. The world made sense by being listed. Outside, through the processing room's narrow window, the night pooled into orange streetlight. The heater's glow seemed distant from inside the station, more an image than warmth. The technician who had handled the tag finished her entry and sealed the evidence kit. She carried it to the evidence locker with a measured step, sliding the kit into a numbered shelf. She did not know in that moment what later room would read that number and whose eyes would fall on the letters stamped into that small piece of metal. Tom sat on a hard bench and folded his hands. The officers spoke of schedules and calls like readers marking pages. There was no scolding, no triumph. There was only the tidy motion of procedure and a thin, dispassionate kindness that did what it could do within the rules. When they led him down the corridor to a holding cell, he looked once at the table where his things had been displayed. The heater, the bread, and the dog tag in its clear pouch. The objects had changed in status from commodities to testimony. The tag's clickful little sound had already been noticed. It had left an impression small enough to be easy to overlook and sharp enough to be remembered if the right person later chose to remember. The courtroom smelled faintly of old wood and dry coffee. Morning light fell in a long bar across the benches and made dust hang in the air. People sat in quiet rows, a volunteer from the community center, a woman who sometimes slept at the shelter, a reporter with a small notebook. The room had the compact, steady attention of a place that measured lives in minutes and records. Judge Marcus Delaney took the bench with a movement he'd made 1,000 times. He was in his 50s and carried the calm of someone who trusted procedure. The clerk read the charge aloud: shoplifting, items of small retail value. The prosecutor stated the facts plainly. The defense table held a folder of records and a man who looked tired and small in the bright light. Ana Ruiz stood when it was her turn and spoke without flourish. Her voice was direct and practiced. Your Honor, Mr. Mercer is a veteran with documented difficulty accessing benefits. He has no violent history. Given the circumstances, I ask the court to consider alternatives to incarceration. She laid a concise mitigation packet on the table. Service record, notes about missed appointments, and a brief medical note describing chronic cough. The prosecutor answered with the statute and the expected request for enforcement consistent with the law. The exchange was quick, each side working in the formal grammar of courtroom practice. It read like machine parts clicking together. Assertion, response, notation. The judge listened, pen poised, eyes moving from one paper to the next. They brought the evidence forward. The heater was placed under a bright light and looked ordinary, domestic. The bag of bread sat beside it like an afterthought. Between them, in a clear pouch, lay the dog tag. The metal caught the beam and made the letters legible. For an instant, the room shifted focus to a small, bright object on the table. Marcus's hand slowed as if the movement of the day had been caught in a small current. He read the inscription, the name, and an alphanumeric code beneath it. There was no audible reaction beyond the tiny tightening of his jaw. He did not announce anything. He only looked, and the look was like a page turning inside his head. Anna used the moment to call 2 witnesses. The woman from the shelter rose and walked forward. She described nights when cots filled early and people shivered in doorways. She spoke plainly of a particular cluster of evenings when the intake lines were long and the cold sharp enough to make breathing hard. Her words were spare. They landed like details on a map. Next, the community center volunteer came up. She spoke of the clock Tom had fixed, of the radio he had mended for the senior lunch program, and of a small toy left quietly on the table one morning that a boy later found working and hugged. Her testimony painted a picture of steady, useful labor rather than pity. The prosecutor cross-examined briefly, staying on the facts of the arrest. The exchange emphasized the ordinary consequences of the action. Anna returned to mitigation and then framed her request in procedural terms. Expedited medical review, temporary community placement, or deferred disposition with mandated social services. She offered solutions the court could order without sentimentality, steps designed to address immediate need and reduce recidivism. Emotion was not theatrical in the room. It threaded through testimony in small ways. The woman from the shelter's hands folded tight in her lap, the volunteer's voice steady but quick at the edges. Marcus listened to each statement, folding them into the list of facts before him. When the clerk called the unit code aloud from the service record, a small sound, soft and private, left Marcus's mouth. He glanced down at the tag again, and the letters seemed suddenly less like ink and more like a pulse. Nothing dramatic happened. He did not leap from the bench. He did not stand and shout. But his face changed the slightest fraction. A line deepened near the eye. A breath came that was not the same as the air everyone else breathed. The gallery sensed the shift even before words explained it. A reporter's pen hesitated. Voices in the room moved in quieter rhythms. The mechanical pace of arraignment continued. Names were sworn, forms initialed, but a different quality of attention had entered the space, the attention of someone who had been given a new, small piece of evidence to hold. Anna closed with a practical plea. "This court can order health assessment and immediate support without sacrificing the law," she said. Her tone made choices easy to imagine. She did not beg. She offered a way that preserved both order and care. Marcus folded his hands on the bench and looked at the papers in front of him. The gavel lay within reach, but untouched. For a beat, the courtroom contained a single question that was not yet asked out loud. Who was this man when the metal and the code on a dog tag summoned a memory the rest of the room could not yet name? The arraignment moved toward its procedural conclusion, but the pause that had begun when the tag caught the light remained in the air. It hung like an unscored note, the possibility of a different sentence still waiting to be written. The dog tag's letters caught the light again, and something in Marcus Delaney's face changed the way a page changes when you find a margin note. He had seen names before, knit through files and citations, but this glint was different. It was not the name alone that reached him. It was the small stamped code beneath it, a unit marker he had not thought of in decades. The sound of the tag clicking against the evidence pouch was a thin, clear note. It landed in Marcus's ears like a signal, and the courtroom's steady breath seemed a hitch. For a moment, everything narrowed to that single metallic sound. Sand and heat came back to him in the space of a blink. The room dissolved into a hot, bright place where the air tasted of metal and diesel. He was not in a robe, but in a helmet, the world a scatter of noise and movement. He heard a sharp crack, then the bark of an explosion that threw dirt like rain. He saw a figure moving through dust, sleeves torn, face smudged with soot. The man's hands knew exactly where to go. He reached across a field of debris and dragged someone out, bracing his shoulders against the weight of a brother who could not stand. Young Marcus felt fingers press into his jacket, felt breath on his ear and a soft, strangled command. Move. He tried to focus through the ringing, to see who had him, to say thank you. The smell of burning fabric sat under everything. Then another sound, the metallic clack of a tag, a short signal that had once marked identity in the chaos and now marked a face in memory. Back in the courtroom, Marcus's eyes went wet and glassy at the rims. His hand, which had been holding a pen, steadied and then trembled. He did not speak. His breathing slowed in a way that suggested he was listening not to the words in the room, but to a recollection that required attention. The gavel sat unused. Outside, the city's noise was ordinary. Inside, a quiet, larger than speech filled the space. Anna's voice continued in the background, a professional murmur about mitigation and procedures, but Marcus was elsewhere for a beat long enough to make the air feel thinner. The gallery shifted. Someone swallowed. A reporter's pen stopped. The evidence table, lit and ordinary a moment ago, held the dog tag like a key. The flashback's images bled into present detail. Sand grit became dust motes suspended in courtroom light. The heat shimmer transposed into the shimmer of the lamp over the evidence table. Marcus's jaw worked once. He remembered a hand on his collar, a voice saying his name as if naming him back to being. He remembered the weight of being carried. Then, the dull, miraculous sense of being alive, because another man would not let him go. He cleared his throat. The motion was small, but it carried authority. He set the pen down and looked up at the counsel table. "Hold," he said, and the single syllable fell like a stone that halts ripples. His voice did not tremble, but it had the brittle edge of emotion folded into command. There was a stillness then, an instant that felt like the world waiting for a translation. Marcus rose from his bench with a movement that was composed and urgent at once. He did not make a show. He moved with the careful restraint of a man who had seen too much spectacle to trust its power. He approached the evidence table as if approaching a relic, and he reached without theatrics for the clear pouch that held the dog tag. The room inhaled. Cameras adjusted. No one spoke. Marcus held the tag for a beat, the metal flashing in his palm. Memory and record lay in the same small object. He looked up at Tom, who sat with a simple, small posture that did not presume pity or attention. An unexpected hush held the room. In that hush, a quiet voice would fit like an echo. If what you have seen so far resonates with you, consider subscribing to Wisdom and Soul to follow more stories about dignity, memory, and quiet justice. Marcus set the tag down gently and turned to the bailiff. "We will pause proceedings," he said. "A short recess while I confirm a detail." His tone was procedural, but unmistakably different than before. It carried the weight of someone who had been handed a thread and chosen to follow it. As the court clerk rose to note the recess, Marcus's hands were steady, but his eyes were wet. The flashback had arrived like a summons. The dog tag, small and ordinary, had become a hinge between two lives, one past and dangerous, one present and brittle. The recognition had opened a space where law might meet memory, and the room waited to see what would come next. He tapped the bench once, a small, deliberate sound that called the room back to order. The recess had been brief, just long enough for people to move and for small conversations to happen in pockets around the hall. But when the clerk read the case back into session, Marcus Delaney's face was changed by something the judge had seen and felt. "Counsel," he said without preamble, "the court will take a brief moment before ruling. Ms. Ruiz, is there any additional evidence or witness you wish to present in mitigation?" His question was procedural. It invited the defense to place relevant facts on the record. It was not a personal invocation. Anna rose and answered crisply. "Yes, Your Honor. We have a witness available who may corroborate Mr. Mercer's service and the circumstances under which he served. He is present in the gallery and has offered to testify." She squared a small paper in her hand. An address and a telephone number she had been given during the recess. The way she said it made clear she was not asking for theatrics, only for the court to consider material facts. The bailiff leaned toward the bench and spoke low, motioning to a man near the back whose cane leaned at his side and whose face had the hard lines of years in sun and wind. "He says he served with Mr. Mercer," the bailiff reported. "He approached court staff in the lobby and asked to speak to counsel." Marcus considered this for a heartbeat and then nodded. "The law permits relevant testimony. The judge is the arbiter of relevance." "Very well," Marcus said. "Call him." The man came forward with a quiet authority. After being sworn in, he spoke. "My name is Harold Jennings. We were attached in Kandahar in 2009. I remember a man who moved through a blast and pulled me clear when I could not stand. I will not exaggerate. He did what needed to be done." He looked at Tom, then at Marcus. "That man saved my life." The plain fact landed with more weight than any flourish. The clerk added the statement to the record, giving the judge an evidentiary footing that went beyond private recollection. Marcus spoke, folding memory into public duty. This court has an obligation to consider mitigating circumstances where medical need and veteran status intersect. I will order an immediate medical hold for Mr. Mercer and an expedited VA review of his claim. The prosecutor rose. Given the testimony, the state will not oppose a medical hold and expedited review, provided the court sets clear parameters. Marcus agreed, setting a 3-day deadline for the VA liaison's report and ensuring the medical hold was for immediate assessment only. Orders were typed, stamped, and initialed with a brisk efficiency that translated law into action. Officers were instructed to escort Mr. Mercer to medical evaluation and then to a holding facility that could provide immediate warmth and care. The clerk logged the emergency review and the bailiff began the soft choreography of moving people and paperwork with minimal fuss. The room's response was hushed and human. Faces turned in slow motion as the practical effects of a memory rippled outward. Anna coordinated with court staff and a social services contact, making arrangements by phone with a voice that navigated bureaucratic lists into real time. The prosecutor made notes that turned legal authority into phone calls. Someone in the gallery, one of the volunteers, let out a soft, relieved sound that translated to the feeling of a small rescue. Marcus remained composed, but there was a visible release in him that was not theatrical. He folded his hands and added a short sentence that framed the court's moral posture. This court's responsibility is to justice, which includes care when care is warranted. He did not pronounce pardon or absolution. He used authority to redirect resources and to pause punitive measures pending assessment. Before Mr. Mercer was led away, Marcus asked one thing: ensure that any property that can be returned to community use is returned. Where the heater is not a private commodity but a public necessity, preference should be given to keeping it in the community. The officer nodded. The evidence tech made a note about property restitution priority. As Tom was escorted past the bench, Marcus watched him go with a gaze that contained recognition without turning into spectacle. The dog tag, photographed and logged, had moved from a private talisman to a public token that shifted action. The heater, described in the order, had been recontextualized from stolen item to an object with social utility. Outside the courtroom in the corridor, a VA liaison appeared within the hour as the judge had commanded. Medical staff conducted a quick assessment. The paperwork that followed would be slow in parts and urgent in others. The system had been pushed, briefly, effectively, into motion. In the courtroom, the papers were stacked and the gavel lay waiting. The minute the judge used his authority, the case no longer read like a simple petty theft. It read like a node where law, memory, and human need intersected. The action Marcus took did not erase consequence. It reframed it, redirected it toward care, and set in motion a sequence that might finally be measured in something like repair. Winter eased, and Ridgefield began to mend in small, ordinary ways. The VA liaison arrived within days with a clipboard and a key, a misfiled archive box that finally gave up Tom's records. The discovery did not feel like vindication so much as a door, at last, being opened. Paper that had trapped him loosened, and the system, slow and awkward, began to move. Marcus's order had made that first ripple. Medical staff saw Tom that afternoon, A nurse with quick, efficient hands warmed him, set him on antibiotics and inhalers, and arranged a follow-up with a pulmonary specialist. The court's push changed timetables into appointments. The prosecutor and Anna met quietly and shaped a humane path forward. Tom would complete a short program of medical follow-up and VA case management and contribute by helping maintain the community center in modest restitution. Fulfill those terms, the state agreed, and the charge would be dismissed. For Tom, the settlement read less like legalese than like a practical bargain, paperwork as scaffolding for survival. He slept in a real bed that first week, and mornings arrived with a different gravity. The metallic taste in his mouth eased, the cough lost its jagged edges. The small electric heater the hospital lent hissed softly at his bedside and sounded like a promise. He kept appointments. He answered caseworker calls. He learned how quickly steady processes, medication refills, scheduled scans, a voucher for a modest apartment, could begin to knit a life back together when someone in authority chose to follow a thread. The boy on the shelter steps, Leo, was not forgotten. Tom never made the night he saw Leo into a spectacle. He did not put the moment on record in court. He acted. With the volunteer who had testified and a social worker from the VA, he walked into intake and said simply what he had seen: a young man on the edge of freezing. The volunteer, who had watched Tom fix clocks and radios, used a soft practicalness that got results. An emergency voucher that night meant a cot, soup, and a follow-up meeting. Tom went home feeling the smaller comfort of having moved a life from exposure to cover. Weeks later, Leo sat at the center's table with a paper in his hand, an enrollment form for job training, and told Tom he had an interview. Tom's grin was modest but fierce. He offered to polish the fellow's shoes. Back at the center, the heater's restitution happened without ceremony. The owner agreed to donate the unit to the center's assistance pool. Volunteers set it beneath the clock Tom had fixed and hung a modest framed photograph of a dog tag above it. A small plaque read, "Warmth shared is warmth multiplied." The object was useful first, symbolic second. Exactly the order Tom appreciated. His days found a rhythm that felt like repair itself. Mornings at the bench, tools spread on a towel, middays fixing a lamp or a radio, afternoons checking on appointments for those who needed help. He mended toys for children, tightened loose screws on donated furniture, and taught Harold Jennings, who kept coming by, a trick for cleaning contacts on old radios. They worked without grand talk. The work was a language that made utility a form of dignity. Once, Marcus came by without warning. He wore a plain coat, no robe, and left a small envelope with the VA advocate's direct number and a single steady line on the back. The law found him late. I'm glad it finally did. They stood facing one another by the bench. Brief, wordless recognition between men who had once relied on each other in dangerous places. There was no spectacle, only the private tilt of two heads, a nod that said more than thanks. The deferred disposition the court agreed to did not erase the episode. It set a new cadence. Tom fulfilled the plan. Medical checkups, case manager meetings, and the community restitution hours he spent at the center. The prosecutor filed the dismissal after the terms were met. It arrived as a short, clean piece of paper that Tom slid into a laminated sleeve behind the counter, not to show off, but so when a bureaucratic question arose, he could say, calmly, it was done. The town's response was not theatrical. Anna organized a paperwork clinic to help other veterans sort benefits. Volunteers kept a list of resources by the door, and the judge's clerk quietly routed a small administrative grant to the Center for Veteran Outreach. The heater stayed on through spring, not as a monument, but as something people used. The framed dog tag photograph caught light sometimes, and people who knew the story would glance up and smile, brief and private. Leo's interview turned into a short training placement. Months later, he told Tom he had passed the first stage and was scheduled for an apprenticeship. Tom polished his shoes and refused the credit with a shrug. "You did the work," he said, and the man smiled small and hopeful. That was enough. Harold Jennings became a steady presence at the bench. When the two of them sat over radios and coffee, they did not recount rescues. They traded wiring tips and grumbled about cheap solder. Their companionship was itself part of how repair works. Practical, hands-on, humbly mutual. At dusk in the community center, the heater hummed and the room smelled of soup and the faint oil of solder. Children laughed when a toy's wheel spun. Volunteers stacked cups, and the clock Tom had mended kept polite time above the workbench. Tom sat with his palm on the replacement dog tag the VA had issued, a practical thing, its letters crisp, and felt the weight of it like a ledger entry. Identity, yes. Access and a lifeline, yes. A chain of small acts that had returned him to the town's care. The plaque on the wall summed it honestly. Dignity is not taken. It is returned when someone finally looks and chooses to act. It was neither claim nor sermon, but a record of what had happened in public and in private. If this story touched you, please like, share, and subscribe to JusticeSoul for more accounts of quiet justice and everyday compassion. And tell us in the comments, what small action would you take today to make someone visible? The heater hummed as the light warmed the room. Tom watched a child play and smiled, a small, private thing, while the ordinary work of care continued. Repair, soup, a hand offered without announcement.